and the Global South. Before we start officially the plenary, I would like to invite Peter Thomas, one of the editors of Historical Materialism journal, who has a word to share with you. Peter?
Four very brief announcements. Firstly, on behalf of the Historical Materialism editorial board, I'd like to thank David and all of the members of the Toronto Historical Materialism team for the fantastic job. This is now established as one of the largest and the main gatherings for Marxist theoretical work in North America. I very much hope that it remains and develops over the next years as a regular gathering for us all. Secondly, I'd like to encourage you all to take out a subscription to the journal. I realize that in these days of immaterial labor, we're accustomed to downloading articles and so forth and using institutional access. I'd like to suggest there are two very good reasons for taking out a subscription to the journal. Firstly, we have an offer for all conference participants of a 25% discount on the subscription price for Historical Materialism 2011. The second reason is that I think we have 1,000 pages a year, more or less, published in the journal. It arrives 4 times a year on your doorstep with a very attractive cover. I think so. Historical Materialism likes to think that we provide something a little bit beyond the normal bland academic publication, so you can also benefit not only from the content of the journal, but also from the appearance. Thirdly, as some of you might be aware, and you'll see here this weekend, Haymarket Books in Chicago are bringing out very modestly priced editions of Historical Materialism books in paperback. We're very pleased to announce that they will also be involved in the distribution of Historical Materialism journal in North America. That will also involve setting up various distribution points across North America and also establishing a number of reading groups who gather around and discuss some of the themes in the journal. I know that David and some of the team here in Toronto have plans for a similar network across Canada, so please keep an eye out for that and become involved. And finally, I'd like to encourage you all to consider attending the Historical Materialism Conference in London. We run a conference every year. This year it's in November from the 11th to the 14th. It takes place in the centre of London and it's become an important gathering point for Marxists from across the world. So if possible, please consider seeing us all again in a few months, this time on the other side of the event. Thanks very much.
I'm Shahzad Mujab, one of the members of the organizing committee. And on behalf of myself and the entire committee, I would like to appreciate the tremendous amount of work and energy of all volunteers that have participated in helping us and assisting us to put this conference together. And that in particular led by one of our graduate students, Sarah Carpenter, who ironically is working on theorization of the problematic of voluntarism. Thank you very much, everybody. So our speakers today for this very important topic, Marx and the Global South, is Vijay, Prashad, and Kevin Anderson. We expected to have a good dear colleague, Hemani Banerjee from York University, to be a discussant on this important plenary. However, unfortunately, due to health problems, she's not able to be with us. And we are very delighted to have Ananya Mukherjee teaching at York in the Department of Political Science, to share her own thoughts on Vijay's presentation and read Hemani's text and response to Kevin's presentation. Very briefly, it's not an easy task to introduce sort of eminent scholars that we have on this plenary, but Vijay teaches at Trinity College in International Studies, and his most recent book, The Darker Nation, won the 2009 Muzaffar Ahmed Books Award, has already been translated in several languages. And Kevin is a professor of sociology and political science at University of California, Santa Barbara. And his teaching and research interest is in Marx, Hegel, Marxist humanism, the Frankfurt School, the Orientalism, and also the Orientalism debate. His newest book, which is on this basis that Hemani has written her response, is called Marx at the Margins, on Nationalism, Ethnicity, and Non-Western Societies, that has been published by the University of Chicago Press. Before further review, please do welcome.
Okay. You see, you forgot to mention that Kevin is a graduate of Trinity College, where I teach. But I of course, didn't teach you, which would have been exciting for me, given sometimes the students that I see. Since your book is called Marx at the Margins, I should have titled my presentation and not been so lazy and written it, and it would have been called Marxists at the Margin. But I didn't do that. I would just like to say that, just as a, how would you say it, prolic benon, I would like to just say that it's interesting for me to read Marxist work, theoretical work, etc. But it's been a long-standing point of disappointment how rarely we engage with Marxist writers who live in the margins. And I've thought a lot about why that is so, why we don't engage with Marxist writers who live in the margins as serious producers of Marxist knowledge and not just of practitioners of revolution, if you understand what I mean. Althusser is the theorist and somebody in Vietnam is a practitioner. The only time we look at the Vietnamese is if they have a manual on how to do revolutionary war, or Che Guevara, manual on revolutionary war. You know, in the margins they have the manuals, and in the center we have the critique in 3 volumes, in language that captivates us, and therefore we must write 1,000,000 books analyzing it to every detail. But the Revolutionary War, well, it's to be taught to undergraduates and scoffed at. So maybe if the journal would like, it might be a good idea at some point to encourage young scholars to take seriously some of the thinkers. And if I had not been so lazy, I would have, for instance, written a full-fledged paper on E.M.S. Namboodiripad, who I have always admired, who would have been 100 years old at the end of this last year, and whose work is finally coming out in some very delicious-looking editions in India. Of course, he was a communist. Of course, you might consider him a Stalinist. Of course, you might consider him to be half the time too much of an ideologue. But the interesting thing is, when he was in his early 90s, late 80s, he wrote every morning in the Kerala newspaper a series on Gramsci. He decided to interrogate Gramsci, and those are some stimulating essays that he wrote on Gramsci. He, of course, in 1937 wrote a minute on dissent on the Agrarian Commission, which is a really landmark understanding on land relations in Kerala. You know, here is a man, 1934, was one of the founders of the Congress Socialist Party, later is one of the founders of the Indian Communist Movement, and died in that movement, you know, died writing. I mean, he, like many, was writing his last article when he died. So, Marxists at the margins, please, some of you change your research projects, learn new languages. What in the Arabic world are they thinking, as well as doing, etc. That's my opening plea. And now, my real presentation is quite weak. It's called Table of Contents. It's essentially the table of contents of the project that I've been involved with. So I'm just going to pretty much read out the chapter titles, and you will make sense of it because you are so much cleverer than I. This hall is a little steep, so it makes me claustrophobic. So if I just start reading these chapter titles, you might, do the thinking for me. Anyway, the project essentially started some years ago, and it was to reconceptualize the last 100 years. I'm nothing if not ambitious of world history. That was the project. And my understanding was that too much is written, once again the third worldist in me comes out, too much is written of things like the Cold War, as if there was no Africa, Asia, Latin America, or where Africa, Asia, Latin America, Middle East, etc. are in a way the battlefield. There are only proxy engagements there, or they are clients of XYZ. But they have nothing to say of themselves. So my interest was, what were they saying? And when I was thinking like this, even as a young militant, I was wondering, why is this the case? That we don't even take, let alone the thinkers, we don't take the movements as seriously as we should, as having a world transformative project. Maybe. Do they have it? Do they not? Don't even ask the question. So at that time I read, Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, and I was struck by a line in The Wretched of the Earth. Not the section on violence, the most overread section of that book. I mean, there's a whole book there, nobody reads. They all think the thesis is in the first chapter, which says a lot about how we read things. But at any rate, in that book, there's a superb bit where Fanon says that this third world has the answers to questions for which Europe no longer is capable. Europe is no longer capable of producing the answers to certain questions. And I thought that was a very interesting formulation. That somebody else has the answers. That Europe is blocked, unable to deliver. Say the Enlightenment is blocked, unable to deliver on certain promises. I was taken with that idea. It's from that sentence that I developed the concept of the Third World Project. That is to say, from the 1920s to the 1980s, there was what I considered to be a legitimate project. You might say an alliance between a national bourgeois formation and national liberation formations. It was an alliance, a global project to transform international relations around the planet. Not just in this country, that country, etc. It was a very ambitious project. So I call that the Third World Project. And then I wrote this book called The Darker Nations, which, was given the subtitles of People's History of the Third World. I mean, Howard Zinn, may he rest in peace. It was a superb gesture to have it in that project, but to be perfectly frank, when I wrote it, I wasn't thinking of it for that series. So it's not quite directly a people's history in that sense, but I think it is a people's history in an earlier sense. If you go back to Morton's, The People's History of Great Britain, if anybody has read that, or England, People's History of England, Morton in the 1930s wrote, I think, one of the early books called A People's History of. I don't know how many people have read Morton. You have. I'm so happy you have. Nobody has heard of it. Oh yes, well, there's a few of you. You're with me then. Okay. All right. So, in that book, I track this Third World Project, which I believe begins to have its move in the midst of the anti-colonial struggle at 1938, 37, 38 in Brussels. The movement has an early articulation at the League Against Imperialism meeting, which is a fascinating meeting, and I wish somebody would be, again, scrupulous, write a big, full book on it. There's a superb archive in Amsterdam, which has the papers from it. It was funded by the Gomindang, and it had, as its organizer, that repellent Marxist Virendra Chattopadhyay, repellent personally, not politically. He was married to Agnes Medley. You might read her version of him. But at any rate, it was a very important conference. The first time many leaders met each other. Nehru meets Sukarno, they meet leaders from West Africa, many of whom are killed when they return home. Because the West saw this as a serious challenge. That movement goes into somewhat hiatus, but not intellectually. They're still thinking these ideas through. And of course in 55 in Bandung, they will meet 29 nations. They articulate a proclamation. A project is laid out. That project is further cemented in 1961 at the non-aligned meeting in Belgrade in 1961. And then 3 years later, drawing from the magnificence of a certain kind of that generation, that is the ECLA project, the Economic Commission of Latin America, whose leading economist was Raul Prebisch. Prebisch will be the first Secretary General of UNCTAD, the UN Conference for Trade and Development. UNCTAD, the non-aligned movement, etc., become the institutional homes of this third world project. And this project intrigued me. Obviously, rife with contradictions, rife with all kinds of class indeterminacies, class challenges. Again, the national bourgeoisie and national liberation forces in constant tussle within this project. Nonetheless, there was unity. And I think it was an interesting project that they articulated. It had its highest point, that is, intellectually and politically, in the early 1970s. It was fortuitous because, of course, the United States, Nixon, they will remove the dollar from the gold standard. They had their own fascinating reasons for doing that. Fine. But it is at that moment that they also write that we are convinced oil prices are going to go up, August 1971. 2 years later, oil prices do go up, but it's not just oil, it's all commodity prices start to go up. There's instability in the world economy. Why? Because currency traders were not so clever. They would be cleverer in the 80s, they would be cleverer in the 90s. They didn't know how to best take advantage of currency movements. People were terrified that their hard-won wealth was going to be lost, so they were buying commodities. Commodity prices start to go up, and OPEC, which had been formed as a piece of the Third World Project. It was formed, they first had a meeting in Cairo, but formed in Baghdad. It was a sideshow of the Third World Project, part of the idea of creating commodity cartels. I can't go on for an hour. You said 15 minutes, 20 minutes, okay. So I'll go quickly. Okay, so I don't know how many of you know these stories. It may not be interesting, but I'm just sharing them with you to set the stage for what I want to say. But 15 minutes to go? Yeah. Making them nervous, you see. So they tried to build power out of the oil barrel, essentially. And they raised the price of oil. Now, this gave confidence to all the NAM countries, the non-aligned countries, and they started to put pressure that all commodities must go towards cartelization. You had a meeting, a very important meeting, the Raw Materials Conference in Dakar, Senegal in 1975, where agreement was reached among many of the NAM states to push for cartelization of all commodities. There was a common fund theory, let's not go, I cannot try to details, the, integrated preference treaties, all kinds of ideas they had. At any rate, in 1973, before the United Nations General Assembly, they brought this resolution called New International Economic Order. The NIEO came and was passed with unanimous consent. Now, I'm lucky. Unlike you, I've been to the Ford Library and I've read the detailed reports of what was happening in the White House. Maybe you have, but it's a fantastic thing. Because in the midst of this, there's discussion inside the White House. We passed the NIEO, we allowed it to get by because the momentum was too much. The next year in the White House, in the library, the Treasury Secretary of the United States invites some important people, that is then 4. They invite the Treasury Secretary equivalents from the advanced industrial countries. Eventually, they'll meet in Rambouillet in 1975, and they are formed as the G7, the group of 7. When they meet in the library of the White House, their point number 1 is what to do about this Third World Project. They don't call it that, it's my name. What to do about this NIEO dynamic. We have to smash it. We have to split OPEC countries from the so-called LDCs. We have to split the poorest countries. They say, Kissinger, delicious Kissinger says the Arabs, the Saudis are feckless and gutless, he says. They won't stand up to the Libyans inside Arab OPEC. He said instead of the feckless and gutless Saudis, we have to support the Shah of Iran. At least he's a good guy. He's under pressure from the Libyans and the Algerians because they were the left of Arab OPEC. So the G7 was not founded for anything else but to destroy this dynamic. They will then meet in Rambouillet, and I have read the transcript of the meeting of all the leaders, and I'm going to read some things from there. Essentially, to make a story short, they crushed the NIEO dynamic, but it gets crushed on 2 fronts. It gets crushed objectively and subjectively. So my first book goes up to the end of the Third World Project. I'm writing a second book called The Poorer Nations, not the People's History, it's called A Possible History of the Global South. And the first 2 sections open with the attack or the death of Atlantic liberalism. And the second section, the second part is the end of third world radicalism. And then the rest of the book is my fantasy of the global south. But I'll just tell you about the first two, and later you can ask me about what I dream of. Atlantic liberalism had its highest moment in the Brand Commission. There's no time to tell the whole story. Yeah, briefly, okay. Robert McNamara, who guilty as hell from Vietnam, goes to Willy Brandt, who had really done something interesting with Ostpolitik, trying to reach out to bring Eastern Europe into Western Europe's capitalist embrace. But he colored it, I think, this is my interpretation, with this wonderful, peaceful thing that we should all embrace across Europe. Well, it was now from Ostpolitik, what I understand as Südpolitik. Move to the south now and embrace them. And McNamara asks Willy Brandt. Willy Brandt then assembles a bunch of commissioners, unlike the Pearson Commission, your great Canadian Prime Minister, where it was a bunch of grand eminences that met in the late 60s and they said we need to increase aid. Brandt actually brought some people like L.K. Jha and others from the south to be commissioners alongside him. It was a very interesting commission, but deeply limited. Deeply limited because their only response to what was happening is attack, concerted attack on the NIE, the dynamic. Their only response was global Keynesianism. This was already, in a way, anachronistic. It had become anachronistic objectively. In other words, objectively, everybody had figured out that this world system was going to be transformed by the 1970s. And let me just read from you from this secret meeting of the G7, and this is Helmut Schmidt of Germany. He's referring to Harold Wilson in the first line. He says, Harold, you talked of viable industries and indicated that they excluded lame ducks. You referred to textiles as an example. Listen to this carefully. This is the only thing you should listen to carefully, okay? I am a close friend, this is in 1975. I am a close friend of the chairman of the Textile Workers Union in Germany. It is a union of a shrinking industry. I would hope that this would not be repeated outside this room. Wow. Is this not collision? Am I a conspiracy theorist? These are the world's 7 industrial countries colluding with each other. I would hope that this would not be repeated outside this room. Given the high level of wages in Europe, I cannot help but believe that in the long run, textile industries here will have to vanish. We cannot ward off cheaper competition from outside. We will eventually need some hothouse or botanical garden for this industry. Now listen to this line. It is a pity because it is viable. Capital invested in the job in the textile industry in Germany is as high as it is in the German steel mills. But wages in East Asia are very low compared with ours. The garment industries in France and Italy, which make high fashions, will survive. They are ingenious and creative and will survive. The German textile industry is viable, but will vanish in 10 or 12 years. Will vanish. There is an objective dimension to this. Fine. They are giving away, in a way, to capital. See, I think David Harvey is correct when he analyzes the emergence of neoliberalism, but the one dynamic he doesn't have there is the destruction of the NIEO, is the attack on the third world. He has located as an important originating point for neoliberalism the municipal crisis in New York City, which they also talk about in Rambouillet. That's an important moment. But there's an entire other thing going on, which is the crushing of this other dynamic. See, just a few minutes later, Schmidt will say, it is desirable to explicitly state for public opinion that the present world recession is not a particularly favorable occasion to work out a new economic order along the lines of certain UN documents. Okay, that had to be smashed. That had no place in the current conjuncture. Okay. They had to clean up the World Bank and the IMF. McNamara, gone. Replaced by whom? Replaced by the head of the Bank of America, Tom Clausen. McNamara's deputy had to go. Hollis Cherney, very interesting liberal thinker, had to go. In his place, Anna Kruger. They cleaned up the World Bank. Anna Kruger now I think is a dean in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins. They cleaned up the World Bank. They brought in, they were committed to a defense against inflation. They had to produce the idea that inflation is the great demon of the world. That was the World Bank. IMF cleaned up as well. You know, we have a theory, IMF has always been bad. That might also be somewhat troubling because IMF, until the 1970s, had no interest or concern with much of the so-called developing world. The loans it gave out were minimal until the 1970s, or those conditionalities, it's basically from the 70s. The interesting head of the IMF in the 70s, you had Vijay, who was a Sufi, semi-conservative guy from Holland, but also practicing Sufi. Vijay was interesting because he argued in the 70s, don't let petrodollars be recycled through private banks, which plays a huge role in the debt crisis of the 1980s in the global south. He said, let the petrodollars be recycled through the IMF, where we create a development bank. Okay, he was a liberal. He had to go. In his place comes a Frenchman, very conservative monetarist. So they clean up these institutions. You must add this story to Harvey's story. Otherwise, neoliberalism seems to arrive in New York and then it's sort of gifted to the world through Jeffrey Sachs, etc. It's not that easy. This project had to be destroyed. So they bring these people on board. Then they had to destroy the legitimacy of the United Nations. Here, there's a fantastic story about the laws of the sea negotiations. 10 years, the countries of the world, in good faith, sat around negotiating if there are some seabed mining that happens in international waters and corporations or other entities are able to bring out something of value, who gets the rent from it? And they spent 10 years trying to deliberate how to divide the rents of wealth in the seabed. Okay. In this period, in the Carter and then in the Reagan administration, you begin this policy of systematically and deliberately undermining and destroying the United Nations, such that at the World Conference in Population in Mexico, the United States shows up and opposes, for the first time openly, population control. Okay, because they just wanted to, at every turn, squash the UN's attempt to have any legitimacy. And it's from this point on that the UN is slowly constricted to the Security Council. All other agencies are going to be deemed illegitimate. You may remember the UN, American ambassador to the UN, John Bolton, you think was bad. Jean Kirkpatrick was abysmal. She was the Reagan UN ambassador. At every point, the UN had to be delegitimized. So this was the subjective attack. There was an objective process which was to give the keys of the kingdom to the big bankers, to allow them ideologically to put the word out that inflation is the big enemy, but then there was a subjective process of cleaning out the World Bank and the IMF of liberals and then delegitimizing the UN. Another process is ongoing. Julius Nyerere and other people like him, old hand third world radicals, very disheartened by the way Brand and his commission were received in 1981 at a meeting at Cancun, where the countries came to meet. By the way, the Algerians said, we'll come, but Brand can't come. They were angry that Brand had in a way stolen the thunder of the NIEO, the New International Economic Order, and had sort of watered it down in this Atlanticist liberalism rather than third world nationalism. So Brand didn't come to the meeting to discuss his own work. Nyerere and others met in Arusha first, then they met in Delhi, they met in various places thinking, is there a way to bring this dynamic back? Eventually, the non-aligned movement will create its own commission, and I spent the last whole bunch of period reading the papers of the South Commission, which is in a nuclear shelter in Geneva. It's amazing, very cool and nice in there, and nobody has read the papers. And why I was interested in it originally was the General Secretary. Oh, I'll tell you the story the other way around. In the NAM meeting in 2006 in Havana, Cuba, Chavez said, it's time to revive the South Commission, its positions, etc. He said, we're happy to have here the Secretary General of the South Commission. And immediately everybody saw this man duck his head under the table. It was the Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, who was the General Secretary of the South Commission. And I was interested in his papers as well in the commission. But the commission fought for its entire meetings. 86, 87, 88, 89, 90. 5 years they could have no consensus. Why? There were two roads in the commission. There was a so-called, what I consider to be the Singapore road of Sinnathamby Rajaratnam, which I write about in Darker Nations, and the Cuban road. Carlos Rafael Rodriguez and others holding a Cuban road inside the South Commission. It was a major split event because the two lines inside the Third World Project were coming apart. The national bourgeois line, where there was no longer really a national bourgeois. This period had untethered the bourgeoisie from national considerations in many ways, but still it was a national bourgeois line which could say, we want to follow the Chinese model, which really is not the Chinese model. It means we accumulate, they work, etc. But there's that line, and then well, maybe that is the Chinese model, but that may be your opinion. That's one line. The other line was saying, no, we have to deepen struggles, equity, etc. Going back to Hollis Cherney's redistribution through growth, not growth, then redistribution. That really was the difference in the two lines. And eventually the report is produced. But it was a very limited report because they couldn't come to terms with monetarism. They couldn't come to terms with finance. They didn't know how to deal with the hegemony of the bankers. They didn't understand how to, as it were, tether banking power, financial power. How do you build anything when you're thirsty for investment? In a world where the banks are choking the rest of the planet, where there's no investment, where they have to come on their knees for capital, etc. How do you break through that dynamic? This debate continued and was not resolved. The South Commission report was published on the morning when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. So nobody read it. Nobody cared about it really. It's kind of a tragedy. It's a 5-year thing. But the report is very interesting because it's filled with these contradictions. They could not agree. And the way I'm working out the problematic is I think we still don't agree. I mean, that is to say, we might think we have the right answers to solve the world's problems. But I was in a panel earlier where somebody raised the question, is it class first, imperialism first, etc. We are still struggling with this basic issue of how do you create, is it socialism? Is it social democracy? What are regimes able to create right now? Is there a breakthrough project out of something like the death of the NIEO dynamic? The NIEO dynamic was an important moment. It is gone. One cannot be nostalgic for it. There are some objective changes now. What is the new project? I believe we don't have that project yet. I believe we have many struggles. I believe we have resistance. I believe when resistance accumulates and seizes power, it is unable to articulate a new project against what we have today. I think we are in a situation of stasis. And it is my hope that intelligent intellectuals like yourself will be studying many movements, but not just the many movements. Not just the movements against power, but also ways to articulate against the system where power has absorbed so much authority, ideological, political, economic, that it has become almost impossible for people to come out of the smothered situation in which they live. So yes, I celebrate and champion resistance, but where is transformation? Thank you so much.